Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, as part of our series about how democracy could work better, I'm talking to Hannah White, who's the director of the Institute for Government, and we are discussing the legislature. Why has democratic lawmaking become so fraught? And how might parliamentary politics be improved? The episode that you are about to hear is focused on UK politics, and I'm very conscious that we have many listeners who are not based in the United Kingdom. We're going to be talking about the legislature and the difference between legislative and executive politics. I think most people are familiar with that distinction, particularly in relation to the United States. The executive is the presidency, the legislature is Congress. In the British case, when we talk about the legislature, we mean Parliament, and Parliament includes the House of Commons and, as you'll hear in just a moment, the House of Lords. The executive is the office of the Prime Minister and the rest of his or her, at present it's his, government, the ministers, not the MPs. That should all be clear as we go along, and we're not just talking about Britain. We are also talking about things that I hope resonate with you wherever you are. Hannah, we're going to talk broadly about Parliament, focused on the UK Parliament and how it could work better. But I want to start with the question of second chambers, because it's a subject that comes up a lot when people think about how democracy could work better. Somehow the focus sometimes seems to be on second chambers because it feels like it would be easier to reform second chambers than the primary legislative chamber, though, as I think we're going to talk about in the UK case, there's not much evidence it is that easy to reform it because we've still got the House of Lords. But in an ideal world, what is a second chamber for? Leaving aside the practicalities of how it works in the UK, what would you want a second chamber to do if you could construct one from scratch?
Well, there are different functions and different second chambers prioritise different aspects of the potential role that a second chamber can play. But normally, a lot of the value comes down to the ability of a second chamber to really enhance the scrutiny of legislation, to make sure that expertise is brought into the process often, maybe a slightly different political perspective, because second chambers, if they are elected, are often elected on a different system or timescale to the first chamber. They can sort of introduce a slower pace into the process somewhat. If you have only a single chamber, then a government with a strong majority can really race through a legislative programme. And having a second chamber means that the government has to really think about how it's going to pace and get its programme through. In other places, the most important role for a second chamber can be about representation. Often it's about having either certain minorities adequately represented in the legislature or certain geographies. If you have a federal system or a system where you need to make sure that the whole of a country is adequately represented, you can do that through a second chamber. So it can be a variety of these things. Obviously, in the UK, that latter role is less of a feature.
And it feels like those versions are pulling in pretty different directions in the sense that, this is putting it a bit crudely, but one way of thinking about it is you want it to be less democratic than the primary chamber because you think the job is expertise, it's scrutiny, it's bringing in perspectives from people who might not get elected under a normal system. Or there's the view you want it to be more democratic, depending what you mean by democracy, but more representative in certain ways. And presumably it's very hard to be both.
It is. And I think one of the reasons we sometimes don't get very far with our debate about the House of Lords here in the UK is that people are coming at the desire to reform the House of Lords without a clear consensus about why you would want to do that. And I think we often resort to debates about numbers and processes of how you might get people to retire and sort of the minutiae of the structure of a second chamber, because some people are saying we must reform the House of Lords because it is insufficiently democratic and it looks like an anomaly, particularly although the Labour government is now dealing with this issue because of the presence of hereditary peers up until now. And other people are saying we want to make sure this is a really strong expert house, which is not going to get caught up in the same political battles which will be going on in the Commons, but is bringing something different. And as you say, it is quite hard to achieve both those things simultaneously.
Does the present House of Lords, do you think, do that job of improving legislation? In your experience of it, does a bill that goes into the House of Lords and then comes out again often look better? Can we say that that is actually being fulfilled, that function?
I think I would say it is, yes. And particularly as the House of Commons is getting less and less good at scrutinising legislation, in some ways the House of Lords is really the only place in which that is happening. And I think it's quite important to be clear what is going on in the legislative process, because sometimes if you can't see the government being defeated and lots of visible dramatic sort of moments on the floor of the House, people think, oh, what difference is this actually making? But actually, a lot of what happens in the legislative process is almost sort of behind the scenes. You end up with a debate, a point being raised, which leads to a subsequent government amendment, the government accepting a point and deciding to amend its own bill, which is then pretty much invisible to the outside observer. And then occasionally you do have battles on the floor of the House. And I think a really important role that the House of Lords does play is just occasionally, and it's a sort of a relatively big bazooka to be brought out when they really feel strongly, but occasionally really pressing the House of Commons to think again about something that wouldn't happen if you didn't have a second chamber. There can be something which is a sort of emerging as a debate when a bill goes through the House of Commons, and then the Lords will pick up on it, or might pick up on something that wasn't even thought of in the House of Commons, and send amendments back to the Commons and say, did you really mean this? I mean, maybe you did, and you are the elected House, and at the end of the day, if you really meant it, then that's how the bill should be. But we just want to give a chance for that debate to develop, for you to read the expertise that the House of Lords has brought to this, and potentially think again. And I think it is really important to have that role. And for me, if we are to reform the House of Lords, that would be the thing that I wouldn't want to lose.
We're going to talk about why the House of Commons has got less good at getting legislation right. But what you just said there is really interesting in the broader perspective of this and thinking about democracy and how it works and how it could work better. My sense of the House of Commons is that there's an ideal version of a representative assembly in which the debate itself, the exchange of views on the floor of the assembly, is where ideas get threshed out. And I think it's fair to say that doesn't happen, when I've been watching anyway, doesn't happen very often in the House of Commons. But if it's true that in the House of Lords, things that are said in debate, so not just in committee or offstage, but in the context of a debate in the chamber about a piece of legislation, actually are the things that make the government pause or reflect. That is quite rare. I mean, I hadn't quite appreciated that, actually. If that is happening, that's a little closer to some versions of the ideal legislative process. John Stuart Mill in the 19th century had this naive faith that somehow if you got people together in a chamber, in an actual legislative chamber, the exchange of ideas would spark new ideas. Are you actually saying that that does happen in the House of Lords? Because if it does, that's a big plus.
I think it does happen. I am not saying it's happening day in, day out on every piece of legislation. But, there are real experts in the House of Lords. There are, senior lawyers, judges, former civil servants and politicians who have real expertise to bring to bear. And I mean, there are constraints on what the House of Lords can achieve. They're not allowed to do detailed scrutiny of money bills. If there is a big and complex piece of legislation going through, in practice, the House of Lords has to pick its battles and has to sort of come to some sort of consensus across the different parties. And of course, no party has an absolute majority in the Lords on what the key issues are that they're really going to challenge the Commons on. And sometimes if you have a very broad and wide-ranging piece of legislation, that means that really important things don't get much scrutiny because the Lords has to focus in on the things that it really thinks it wants to make a point to the Commons about. But I certainly think that there are examples of this. Actually, if you're just watching, what comes through on the BBC and sort of looking superficially, you miss quite a lot of what can happen in terms of legislation being made better. But it does also rely on the government to have the right attitude to Parliament, I think, because sometimes, and arguably increasingly more recently, you have a government that comes in and says, well, we have a majority in the House of Commons. We're just, we're not interested in anyone amending our legislation. We just want to push it through. And we have the legitimacy to do that. A sensible government, I think, takes the attitude, if we miss things when we're passing laws and further down the track we're trying to implement legislation which actually isn't workable, or problems come back to bite us, actually wouldn't we rather know that and have that pointed out to us by an eminent member of the Lords than just assume that any amendment coming back from the Lords and taking more time on the floor of the Commons is an annoyance and something to be avoided.
Given that in the House of Lords, as you say, there isn't a party with a majority, it's structured that way, does it offer any kind of glimpse of what a politics might be like if that were true in the Commons as well? So say after a reform of the electoral system, so that we had a version of PR in which it was very unlikely that any party would have a majority. Does the House of Lords give any sense of the ways in which politics more broadly would be different, or is it so much its own thing, not least because most of them aren't professional politicians, that it's not really a guide to that?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think probably I would look at other Westminster-style democracies with elected chambers, multi-party elected chambers, before I looked at the Lords, partly just because the procedures of the Lords and the Commons have developed in such different ways. It's much more informal, the procedure in the Lords. And part of the reason I think the Commons has struggled when we've not had a strong majority outcome from an election is because all its procedures are geared towards dealing with a binary outcome. And that's to do with, how much time the main two parties get on the floor of the House to talk about things, what roles they get in the parliamentary system, and those sorts of things. And as soon as you have a strong third party, which you do at the moment with the Lib Dems and you did with the SNP, the system really disproportionately disadvantages that third party. And so I think if we were to regularly get to a situation of having multi-party outcomes from elections, and arguably this is something that Parliament ought to start doing already, we really need to look at those procedures and think about actually how you would have to balance the opportunities in the House, time, roles, and those sorts of things to reflect that sort of electoral outcome. At the moment, I think every time it's happened, we've told ourselves it's an aberration and we can muddle through with basically the very binary procedures that we have in the Commons. Actually, I think we ought to be thinking seriously about how you would change procedures in a way. But it's not in the interests of the Conservatives and Labour to do that thinking, really. They'd like to maintain the idea that one or other of them is always going to be in power, and so that sort of work isn't needed.
And one of the weirdnesses of now is it's almost surreal the way in which, as you say, the Liberal Democrats did very well in the last election. They have got a lot of MPs and they're almost invisible, and it feels like they're invisible even in the Commons. The party that had 5 now has 4. Is everywhere. Nigel Farage himself, but also Reform, they loom as a kind of unofficial opposition with no institutional mandate for that role at all. I don't know if you feel it would be different if the Liberal Democrats had some kind of institutional purchase on the government that whatever reforms gave them because they came a very good third, or really still in the Commons, politicians look at the opinion polls and the person who's ahead is the person that they focus on.
I think it would be iterative. Obviously, as I've said, I think it would be desirable to sort of revisit Commons procedures and think seriously about them, even where we are now, without even more sort of multiple opposition. I think the Lib Dems went into the last election with a very local set of campaigns and far fewer national policy platforms. I think if Parliament gave them and expected them to have more opportunities to be putting forward national policy positions in different areas, more time to challenge the Prime Minister's questions, more opportunities to decide subjects for debate, that sort of thing, it would push the party to have more of those sorts of national policy positions. So you wouldn't end up with a party that, both for its reasons of its own electoral choice in how it was very successful in converting its vote share into seats at the last election, but also because of the lack of opportunities for a third party. It is, as you say, very, very quiet. But also, the point you make about reform, it's not because of the brilliant speeches which are being made by Reform MPs in Parliament, or the way in which they're participating in sort of committees or anything like that they're getting attention. It's the way they're in the media. And as you say, I think that is a conclusion of both novelty, but also where they are in the polls, and the fact that that's where the media's decided the interesting story is. And that's, of course, also because the Conservative Party has been relatively quiet in terms of its policy platform, because Kemi Badenoch has said that she's wanting to take some time to develop that, and really hasn't been very visible herself.
Before we talk more broadly about the role of the Commons and indeed legislatures in general relative to the power of the executive, one more question about the House of Lords, which is not so much about the Lords itself. It's a question about how democracies can reform themselves, because I think people inside Britain, people outside Britain, one of the things that really stands out is that politicians have been talking about reforming the House of Lords for more than 100 years. And of course, there have been changes. There have been pretty significant changes. But it looks almost impossible to do it in the way that the politicians talk about doing it when they are in their enthusiastic, we must reform this institution phase. It either gets diluted or it gets parked, or other things become more important. And maybe other things always are more important. But what does it say about the British system and the ability of a well-established, long-standing democracy to reform itself, that we can't reform the House of Lords? Does it tell us something profound about the difficulty of democratic reform?
I mean, I think a big part of it is, as you say, the fact that politicians are often wary of looking like they're focusing on constitutional change when there are, real life problems facing voters, cost of living, immigration. They're wary of saying this is our big focus and looking out of touch. And that's a danger because, as you say, wholesale House of Lords reform is very difficult to do because you're asking the House of Lords to reform itself. And it's important to say that there are lots of members of the House of Lords who are the strongest advocates for reform of the House of Lords. It's not that they're all turkeys refusing to vote for Christmas. But the real problem, I think, and we touched on it at the start, is that there is just a lack of consensus about what a reformed House of Lords should look like, what its role should be, whether it should be elected or appointed. And so even within a party which is saying House of Lords reform is a priority for us, there are normally as many different versions of what a reformed House of Lords would look like as there are people in that party. And that's why I think there's relatively rarely been sufficient political appetite to embark on a big programme of reform, because it's very easy for the House of Lords to make it very time-consuming for a government to pursue a big programme of reform. This is what the Lib Dems found in the coalition government. We've seen it with the Hereditary Peers Bill going through at the moment. It's been really, really slowed down. Arguably, that's a relatively minor reform. But a government has to accept that if it's going to try to do Lords reform, it's not going to be able to do lots of other things which are going to be important to its electorate. And so that is very well established that it's hard to do. And so you have to really have strong political consensus that you want to do it, that you know what the outcome is, that that outcome is worth securing, and the time to do it. So it's normally then seen as a second or third term issue. And then the governments that get a second or third term aren't necessarily so frequent or focused on that by the time they get there. I think that the thing that could potentially make the difference, and this is my sort of secret solution for the would-be House of Lords reformer, is that the public need to be given more of a say over what the Lords should be and should look like. I think if you were to conduct and run some kind of deliberative process where you got a public mandate for a certain version of the Lords which was doing something in the way that, say, in Ireland was done over some complex sort of constitutional questions and so on in Ireland, I think it would make it easier to then drive Lord's reform through, because you would not just be saying, a set of politicians have managed to get enough will behind doing this that they're embarking on it, but you'd be able to say the public has endorsed a certain view of what the Lords should be. And if you stand against it, it's the public's view that you are seeking to oppose.
The way you described it up front and what you've just said seems like the solution to this problem. But the way you described it up front, you can see that not just British politics, it could happen in many democracies, but maybe it is really happening now in British politics, can get stuck in a vicious circle where constitutional reform of any kind, changing the way we do politics, is too time consuming when the public want action on bread and butter issues, cost of living issues, and politicians feel that they can't devote time to it. But the reason there is so much frustration with politics is politics isn't working particularly well. And you can imagine that spiraling in a way. We have less and less time for constitutional reform because the public is so impatient. But the public is so impatient because their politics isn't working well. And it does feel like the only way to square that circle is to, as you said, give the public a stake in this. Even that could be a version of it, because a deliberative assembly, a deliberative process on the House of Lords requires a government to take seriously the idea that deliberative politics is one of the ways in which they might want to reform the system, and that means they've got to devote time and energy to selling that. But still, if you don't do something like the thing that you described, it does feel like you could get in a spiral in which politicians never have the time to reform a system that's not working because the public is so angry with the system that's not working that they don't have time to reform.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think the other alternative is that you end up with major constitutional reform in some kind of crisis situation. I mean, frankly, and you're the expert on this, David, but if you look back through history, most countries do major constitutional reform in some kind of crisis situation, after a war, after independence, something like that. And constitutional change done in a crisis is not necessarily a recipe for constitutional change done well. I mean, the other circumstance I can conceive of where we might end up with House of Lords reform in the sort of near to medium term here is if a party which is very under or not at all represented in the House of Lords wins significant political power and has an agenda for Lords reform, so that they really don't care what the current members of the House of Lords will think about a thing, and have enough numbers to try to push something through, and it becomes a sort of totemic symbolic for them way to demonstrate that they are moving against vested interests and institutions and elites in a way that actually tallies with their political programme, when perhaps they don't have clear ideas about other things they can do on the domestic front that they know to be effective and that will take their constituency with them.
But that, naming no names, but say Reform won a majority at the next election, that would be more likely, in my mind, to be a version of the crisis reform than there is a political incentive to do this, because you can imagine it being driven simply by a Commons and a Lords that are so out of kilter on even what kind of legislation they're willing to contemplate, say on questions of human rights or whatever it is, that actually it becomes a early 20th century style showdown. And after all, the big reform of the House of Lords happened before the First World War in crisis circumstances. That was the big change. The House of Lords' power was neutered. And you could imagine a 21st century version of that, but that would be, to my mind at least, that would be closer to crisis politics than constitutional reflection.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think that's why, and this applies to both to the Commons and to the Lords, it is really important that members of both houses really take a step back and think seriously about what the public thinks about them. I often, having worked for quite some time in the House of Commons, I often think that people elected or appointed to the two houses are the least well placed to really have a realistic view of those institutions themselves, because they are the people who've chosen this as a meaningful way to spend their lives and to make a difference, and they are the most convinced of the value of the system as it currently operates. And I think too often they say, oh, well, if only people, or they didn't say, but their implicit thought process is, if only people really understood what we're doing here and how valuable it is, they would get it, and actually they would see that actually this is the right way to be doing things. And that just isn't a good basis for people to have a sort of burning platform and think, actually, how do we need to do things differently? Do we need to listen as well as tell? And for my money, part of the answer should be about more processes which actively bring the people people's voice into Parliament, not just relying on constituency MPs to do that.
To be fair, I don't think it's only politicians who are guilty of that vice. Academics often say, if only people knew how hard we were working, they would respect us more. It's probably true of every profession, actually, that people think, if you knew just how difficult this was. On the Commons itself, then, the members of the Commons, they presumably have some idea of in how little regard they are held. They discover it at election time apart from anything else. But the way that the Commons works now, it's often held up as an example, the British House of Commons, of something that may be a wider trend, maybe even a global trend, in which the role, the power, the authority of legislatures is being progressively downgraded relative to the hold of executives on government and on lawmaking. And this could also be a kind of vicious spiral. The more the legislature shrinks in its visibility, the more the executive grows, the more frustrated people get with the legislature. The least popular institution in the United States is the House of Representatives. I don't know if it's the equivalent for the Commons here, but the House of Representatives, which is meant to be the people's house, after all, it's meant to be the one that is closest to the people, is the one that the people really hate. And part of it, I think, is a sense of its relative impotence. Do you think there's anything like that going on in the UK, that the Commons is attracting frustration because people are aware actually it is losing power, and as it loses power, it attracts more frustration?
I can see that that is a good description, as you say, globally of certain sorts of legislatures. I guess maybe more those in systems with a presidential role rather than in sort of Westminster-style democracies. I actually think there's sort of evidence to the contrary in a couple of ways in the UK. The first is that the executive here has always been more powerful, had more control over how the Commons spends its time and the agenda of the House and so on than in many other similar democracies. We've always had a very strong executive here. And then if you look at, and I think it's significant to consider for the UK, both the Brexit process and the COVID process were time constrained situations in which it was important to have a powerful executive that could get stuff done. And the MPs and ministers who were around during those two extreme situations for our governing system got used to, as governments, being able to pass legislation quickly and to take powers in law and to use those powers to do things which were sort of agreed to be important things for the government to be able to do. And so in some ways we have a generation of politicians who that's their lived experience of Parliament in the last decade. But at the same time, I think you have a set of MPs who increasingly are becoming less biddable and less loyal to Parliament, more focused on their own constituencies, more likely to have some kind of local link than necessarily in the past, more willing to put what they see as their assessment of the interests of their own constituents over those of their party in power. They've also seen relatively successful examples of backbench organising, starting with Brexit, with groups like the European Reform Group, and then you had the COVID Recovery Group. And these were groups of backbenchers who got together to work to change the policy of government on these important issues. And they were quite successful. And so you got to a situation where, Boris Johnson came in and had his majority of sort of 80 seats, thought he was going to be able to do whatever he liked, actually discovered that wasn't necessarily the case. Rishi Sunak certainly similarly. And now we've just had the situation with the Starmer government with an even larger majority having to significantly reform its welfare legislation because of the extent of backbench unhappiness in the first year of the first term of a new government, when you might think that MPs would be at their sort of most loyal and keen to push through a new government's agenda. So I think actually having established, a situation in which the executive expects to get its legislative programme through very strongly and easily, there's a bit of a reversal on the part of the expectations of backbenchers.
I'm really interested in what you say. I hadn't really thought about this, that the politicians who are coming into Parliament now maybe have more of a local connection, maybe feel in some ways that they are more accountable to their constituents than they might have done in the past. also in the case of this government, I mean, I think it is a familiar thing, but I think it's the extreme version of it, which is the curse of a big majority, because it's also true that many of them do not expect to be there for more than 5 years. Many of them won on very small majorities, and it is also an age of much more volatile politics. We know that in elections, it used to be thought it took a couple of parliaments at least to overturn a big majority. And now there's a feeling anything could happen next time. The whole thing could be turned on its head again. And that is going to make people less biddable. If you think you're in Parliament for 5 years as a backbench MP and then you'll probably lose your seat and you ask yourself, what am I here for? You will answer, as I believe many of them did, I'm not here to gut welfare provision. I'm not going to have that on my conscience because it's not what I came in to do. For my 5 years, I'm going to serve my constituents as best I can. So it feels like some of it is structural to do with a system that can produce these big majorities. But some of it must have to do, and these things are probably connected to the more local representation, with the intense volatility of our politics now and the ways in which it can turn very quickly.
I think that's right. And I think the other factor for the new generation of Labour backbenchers is that Keir Starmer is sensibly, in the view of the Institute for Government, in terms of the sort of consistency of government, not having a lot of reshuffles. Their potential alternative career of hoping for ministerial preferment doesn't look like there's going to be lots of opportunities for that. And there are some talented people who've come in and won those seats. But if they don't think that they're necessarily going to get to have a ministerial career, then why not make a name for yourself on the backbenches and be willing to stand up for your principles? And if you don't necessarily, as you say, you can't rely on the idea that your party is going to have a second term either, let alone what happens to your own seat, then you want to make sure that what happens in the parliament in which you are present is in line with what you're trying to achieve. So I think for governments now, there is a sense in which they really need to reflect and adjust to this reality for backbenchers and think about that when they want to legislate. They can't just assume that they're going to get things through. They have to do the sort of legwork, the groundwork, and to make the case for the things that they want to try to do, and to do that in a way which is persuasive for their backbenchers, rather than just hoping that because they have a large majority, they can get things done.
The example of Brexit is interesting because it does cut both ways. As you said, through Brexit, there was a real premium on executive action. It was time constrained. It placed a great focus on what the Prime Minister would do. At the same time, there was a period of, 2.5 years in which Parliament in some ways was the most powerful it's ever been in my lifetime because it was stopping anything from being done. But Parliament's assertion of its power in that case was a kind of veto power. I mean, government ground to a halt, not completely, but partially, because there was no majority in Parliament for anything. Famously, people tried and they cycled through the options and no one could get a majority for any, however bizarre, the sort of combination of things that were put together. And so the way in which the Commons asserted itself and in some ways, I think, put itself forward in the public mind was as a blocking institution. And maybe this is wrong, you might tell me this is wrong, but I feel like what happened with the welfare bill was a bit like that in a way. The welfare bill showed people, actually, even a government with a big majority, new in office. I know a lot of the optimism has gone, but still 1 year into what could be the first of a number of terms, you'd think there would be some wind in their sails. And they just ground to a halt over this thing because a group of backbench MPs turned out not to be biddable. But what you got was a gutting of the bill, essentially. I mean, it was almost farcical in the end. They just took out the bit that the MPs didn't like. So it's as though the Commons reveals its power, but in a very negative way. It doesn't feel, certainly in that case and in the Brexit case, it didn't feel particularly constructive. That may be too bleak of you, but I suspect in the minds of the public, I'm not a million miles out of step in saying that.
No, I think that's largely fair. And I think with Brexit, it was a veto power until the very last minute when actually Parliament ran out of public will for its inability to provide an alternative answer. And in the end, you had the legislation giving effect to the Brexit deal gone through both houses of Parliament in 24 hours because the time ran out and the government could get its way off the back of Boris Johnson having won an election, off the back of the public just being sick of the stasis, as you say. But I think that also comes back to something we discussed earlier about the problem of Parliament's processes being built around the binary. The fact is, Brexit was a big and complex issue. Apart from the shall we stay or shall we go, once you got into what kind of Brexit, actually its procedures were really poorly equipped to enable MPs to have a debate and decide on multiple different options. They ended up having to have a sort of a series of these alternative binary votes, and that's just not a good way to reach an outcome. So I think you're right. And I think in the current situation, with the welfare bill, this was exactly MPs saying, well, we're not comfortable with this way of saving money, but being able to do that in a context in which they don't have to come up with, as Rachel Reeves now does, an alternative way of finding the money that they also want to be invested in public services and all the other priorities that they do have for spending money. They were able to successfully stop the government making that sort of cut. But I think Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves could be forgiven a degree of frustration for thinking, well, what is the thing that we're going to be allowed to do which enables us to make those spending increases which we want to make?
So is it the case that the House of Commons is just not well equipped as it currently functions to deal with complicated questions that require, as you say, multiple options? And if that is true, how could it be reformed to do that better? And related to that, what is the real problem here? Is it the volume of legislation? Is it the pace? I mean, government does so much now, and there is so much happening at once. And also there are so many time pressures. Is the Commons overwhelmed by the things that are expected of it?
I think one problem, in my view, is that for governments, the answer they reach for is often legislation when they don't necessarily need to legislate to do the things that they want to do. But legislating is a big, visible way of putting down a marker. This government is doing something about X, whether it's stopping the boats or dangerous dogs or whatever it is. And so there is a sense in which less, better considered legislation and actually, the important thing about legislation really is not what happens in Parliament at all. It's about what you do to develop your legislation before it gets to Parliament, who you've spoken to, what processes you've been through, and whether you've built consensus around sort of certain policy ideas that can be refined in Parliament, but really Parliament is the final stage of the process. And, we have a lot of backbench MPs who have lots of experience they bring to bear from their constituencies, from their former careers, who are available to be consulted by government before the moment at which they're appearing and popping up in the House of Commons chamber. So I think a bit of a reassessment from government about where they put the balance of their effort in terms of engaging MPs would probably help. I do think that we ought to be looking around at other parliaments and the procedures they use in contexts where they have a more plural opposition for reaching decisions, reflecting on whether our procedures, although they have a long history and are often looked to as the epitome of parliamentary procedure because the books we have about it are very long and the precedents are many, are necessarily equipping us, as you say, for the situations we're now in, where we have lots of big thorny issues which are long-term, intergenerational, international, and aren't susceptible necessarily to simple binary answers. And it's not just about Parliament's ability to legislate, it's also about what are the other things Parliament is there for. It's to scrutinise policy implementation, what's happened in Parliament after the fact, because then we can, and select committees can be very good at that, at looking back at what's happened and how things could be done better and feeding those lessons back into government. It's also just, the literal parliamentary function of providing a forum for debate about things, which doesn't have to be linked to a direct policy outcome, but can be, really important things. You could have seen a process for the assisted dying legislation where more of those sorts of debates were had in Parliament in a way that felt meaningful for people before legislation was introduced. And there's all sorts of reasons why it was introduced in the way that it was. But I think, there were multiple functions for Parliament, and just seeing it as a sort of legislative sausage factory is to diminish its potential value. And Parliament needs to reflect on what the public sees as its value if it is actually to be continued to be seen as a useful part of the system.
I'm sometimes struck by those debates like over assisted dying, where commentators often say, well, we're rude about Parliament a lot of the time, but occasionally it rises to the occasion, or at least some of the speeches rise to the occasion, or this is one where you realize that these are serious-minded people and some of them are extraordinarily eloquent in articulating a point of view, but they tend to be rare, one-off and very curtailed events. It doesn't feel like this is feeding into anything. It's almost like a showpiece. It happens every now and then. It sometimes happens when they come together to pay tribute to someone who's died or something like that. And it feels like it's a vision of an alternative kind of assembly where the quality is often very high and then it sort of goes nowhere.
I mean, it's often the occasions on which the party politics are less present for some reason, where it's an issue of conscience. Sometimes when it's about a decision to go to war or something like that, where there are big issues of moral principle. It's also a question of situations where the timing of these things sometimes, what you need is enough MPs to have had enough time to reflect on an issue to be able to bring their expertise and their thinking to bear, because Parliament is very busy and the legislative programme is very packed. And often, I think, with everything else that they're doing, MPs don't have or decide to prioritise the time to engage in legislative business in the way that we might like. And they do see themselves, I think, more and increasingly more as constituency focused. You can't get the same kind of bang for your buck in terms of telling your constituents that you're doing something for them from sitting on a bill committee, going through clause stand part debates, as you can from going on a constituency visit to open a school, or even sitting on a select committee and asking a relevant question of a minister, which then you can clip and put on your YouTube feed. So it's relatively low reward for MPs, and therefore I think fewer of them now than in the past think of it as a priority in terms of their activity.
As you said, people look to the British Parliament. It's the oldest one. The books are longer. There are more of them. Which ones should we be looking at? If you were given a free hand to reform the way the British Parliament works, where would you send your fact-finding teams out to study how the other ones, the better ones, are working? Where does it work best? Is there a view? Is there an Institute for Government view of which Parliament works best in the world at the moment?
I don't think there's any one parliament that gets it all right. That this is the interesting thing. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier the Irish Parliament and the way in which they made use of a citizens' assembly, which the government didn't just decide to set up a citizens' assembly to look at questions like abortion, for example, but they said the outcome from this assembly will go directly into the legislature for consideration, and then there'll be a referendum on this. So it wasn't just advisory. It was actually, we see this as actually part of the democratic process. And that gave a certain weight to the outcome, which actually meant that, the House of Commons has dabbled. We had a citizens' assembly on climate change, for example, which was commissioned by 6 select committees, but really that may have had some influence over their subsequent agendas, but it didn't really lead to anything. So I think that's a good example of how deliberative processes can be built in. I think you don't have to look so far afield again. If you look to Scotland, their committee system is different to ours, and I wouldn't advocate us actually adopting their system, which has committees which do both scrutiny of legislation and scrutiny of government policy and administration at the same time. I wouldn't advocate that for various reasons, but actually what I think I would say we should take from that is that having a set of MPs who have expertise in a certain area of policy then scrutinise legislation can be really beneficial. One of the things the IFG's argued is that you should have in the legislative process a sort of optional select committee stage where the relevant select committee for any bill could say, actually this bill coming through, we'd like enough time built into the agenda for us to do some evidence sessions on this bill, please, before you go to the detailed scrutiny stage. And rather than having, as happens now, a group of random MPs do some evidence taking on a particular piece of legislation, you would have actually the expert MPs who are the ones who do the day in, day out scrutiny, say, of the Home Office, then looking at an immigration bill as it started its passage through the Commons. So those are just a couple of examples. As I say, I wouldn't say there was any one shining example, but there is much we can learn. And one of the dangers, as with many other things, as you say, is that we always look internally and assume that answers have to be invented in Westminster to have any value. And actually, that's very far from the truth.
Presumably, it's also true that legislatures around the world are facing similar challenges to the British Parliament. The challenges of being responsive and accountable in an age of incredibly rapid news cycles and social media, and just being so contactable and open to their constituents. And at the same time, there is a premium on executive action. It feels like there's a premium on executive action, not just in the sort of flagship examples of countries where the executive is throwing its weight around, but more generally. Is it right to think that the public seems to be hungry for stronger executives and more executive action? There are sometimes polls that suggest that people's frustration with parliaments and with politics generally, representative politics, has led to a new appetite for stronger executive government. It's sometimes framed as strongman government. I don't think you have to use that word, but a stronger executive that gets things done quicker, bypasses some of the snares and snags in the way. Do you think it's right that there really is a genuine public appetite for more of that?
It does depend on the circumstances. I think there was certainly some piece of polling or a survey that found that quite strongly and alarmingly, I think, during the Brexit years. And during that time we were discussing when Parliament was very much standing in the way of progress of Brexit, couldn't agree on what alternative outcome it wanted to what the government was pursuing. And there was a strong sense in one of those surveys that people just thought, well, we just need a strong man who doesn't have to bother with Parliament. I think actually the polling on that has shifted again since and moved away from that in the UK, that actually people, when you tend to ask them slightly more nuanced questions about this, do see the value of, different people's votes being represented in the system, it not just being a sort of winner takes all type situation. But I think there is no getting away from the fact that if you have political parties who are willing to say there can be simple answers, and all that's standing in the way of that simple answer becoming reality is not the sort of complexity of achieving something legislatively or organisationally or in the implementation of policy, but just the fact that this set of MPs are opposing it, then that's a quite nice simple answer, isn't it? That actually if you can just change those people or again do away with that institution or reduce its power, you can have the thing you want. So I don't think we're there yet in the UK, but the more that politicians are willing to have a politics of sort of easy answers, the more there is a risk that the public says, okay, well, why are we worrying with all this sort of parliamentary debate and representation business?
So to finish, I want to offer you a scenario, and then I want you to tell me of the various things we've talked about, which way you think it's likely to go, which is the possible scenario after the next election. So we have a parliament now where there is a government with a big majority, so it is working in a way that is familiar, even though I think the government is being surprised by the ways in which it's frustrating, but it is still familiar. I think the curse of a large majority is not unique to Keir Starmer. But it's also an unusual parliament for the reasons we talked about. There is a powerful third party. There's quite a powerful fourth party in the SNP. And there is a very powerful, I don't know where they are in the list, seventh. There are fewer of them than there are independents. But wherever Reform are, dominating the political agenda. And it is possible to imagine after the next election that the public return to Parliament an almost ungovernable configuration of many different parties. So say we got a scenario after the next election in which Reform had the most seats but not enough for a majority. Labour and the Conservatives have been reduced to a kind of rump, each of them 140, say. Still strong Liberal Democratic presence. Corbyn's new party, there aren't many of them, but a few more of those independents speaking for very local constituencies, weirdly on very international questions, because that's what those independents are. The Greens might have done better. Who knows? A patchwork nightmare for someone trying to form a government. And under those circumstances, there are all sorts of different responses, one of which might be this is a time, it's a bit of a crisis, but it's not the end of the world. This is a time to really rethink how we do this. Should we take this as the new future and think of what government would be? Either we got to reform the electoral system, or we've at least got to reform Parliament so that it takes account of all of this variety. Or do you think that might produce even more impatience for someone just to take charge and get something done? And it feels like there might well be a test of these questions coming up, which is The same situation might both be the opportunity finally to reform some of this and get a grip of it. Reform, not in the sense of the party name, but change the way that Parliament works, make it work better. And at the same time, it might be under conditions where at least one politician, Nigel Farage, is saying, I need more power. Here I am, the people want me, the public have voted for me, and I'm just being completely stymied by this institution. And might just keep calling elections, might just keep triggering elections until he gets that. Feels to me like we could be heading to a point, not something terrible or apocalyptic, but where these two things are really in tension in the same institution at the same time. Are we going to try and make this institution work better? And can we do it under conditions, because it's clearly not fit for this situation, under conditions in which that drumbeat of make me prime minister and I'll stop the boats is getting louder and louder?
I mean, I think, as you say, it's an entirely plausible situation. I think, to give the boring answer, the highest likelihood in our current system in that sort of situation is that a largest party leader, Farage, would call another election and you would get a slightly clearer outcome once people saw. So either he would then up his numbers to something closer to a proper minority government or even a majority government sort of situation, or and one of the other parties would manage to, either having people seen the outcome of the previous election, make a different case that was more successful for them, and you could end up with enough numbers to form a coalition or something like that. So I think the most likely situation is you would end up with further elections. I think trying to do the sort of quite complex constitutional change you would need in the circumstances of a genuinely fractured House of Commons would be pretty hard, particularly if the largest party was saying, this is about giving us more power to get our agenda through. Actually, what they would be saying is, let's maintain the status quo largely. I mean, that said, in COVID, Parliament actually showed that it could reform its procedures in a crisis, but that was when there was very strong consensus about what the national interest was in terms of keeping a parliament going, rather than trying to reform things in a way which would balance in an appropriate way the different party interests of a multi-party system. This is why I said earlier, I think this thinking needs to be done now. You need to do it in a situation where you're not already in that very difficult situation, and think through the principles of how you think it should work. The thing that I think is less likely, weirdly, in that sort of scenario you described, David, is that you would end up with electoral reform in terms of the voting system, because I think what a Reform Party, which hitherto has been quite keen on the idea of some form of proportional representation, would conclude from having come out as the larger party, even if not able to form a government, was that actually first past the post could work for them. So they'd be less keen in that sort of situation, I think, necessarily to start advocating for electoral reform.
You don't think there's any scenario in which British politics doesn't do grand coalitions. It does coalitions reluctantly, if at all, but that there might be a grand coalition of the other parties, including some like the Labour Party, which might have realised its future now is only secure under some kind of electoral reform system, to cobble together a government to change the system, not just to keep reform out, but they all, bar reform, recognise it's in their interest. Maybe even the Conservative Party too at this point. Who knows? I doubt it. Seems unlikely, certainly not under Kemi Badenoch, or Robert Jenrick, so someone else. But anyway, they see it as in their interests to seize the opportunity of the prospect of a Farage premiership being reinforced by another election to finally make the change.
I mean, I think that is the most likely scenario in which you could end up with electoral reform. I just think the noise would be so loud from reform, which is very good at the kind of getting media attention and so on, and also making the case that, all these other parties are a sort of uni party who are basically all have the same policy agenda and they're trying to keep us out. And so I think in that scenario, obviously, if you're going to do electoral reform, what you really want is broad-based consensus across the political parties that, this is the way forward, and it needs to have legitimacy. Those would be pretty bad circumstances in which to try to introduce it if you had reform sort of crying foul from the sidelines and telling people that this was just a way to stop the will of the people being expressed.
Which does make it sound very hard to reform a system like this while it is functioning. It is under so much pressure in so many different ways. And to go back to what we were saying earlier, you can imagine the kind of crisis scenario in which it has to change, but no one should wish that kind of crisis on any system. When it's just trying to work or work better, it almost feels like the pressure of working better in a way that meets public expectations makes changing the way it works almost impossible.
On the one hand, that sounds entirely logical, doesn't it? And I think as soon as you are a victor in the system, your incentive to change it just ebbs away. On the other hand, you and I both can point to examples of when the parliamentary system has been changed, normally in, as you say, relatively extreme circumstances, and in more minor ways, but important ways, in the sort of cracks and wedges type sort of thing. Select committees now much better and more effective than they were pre-2010. I would say more effective at their role. For example, we've got topical questions and debates, which, if you look back, there was a real critique that everything Parliament talked about was, a month out of date. But now they've made the change that actually you can talk about the thing which is the subject of the day, and you can have your emergency debates and these sorts of things. So small changes do happen. And actually, in some ways, Parliament is constantly reforming itself in small ways. It's just some of the bigger, more systemic questions and points of principle which we've been discussing today, which do feel very hard to achieve if they're not in the interests of the people who actually have the power to achieve them.
The second half of my conversation with Hannah White will be available on PPF Plus on Saturday. And we are going to be broadening the topic out, not just from Parliament and the legislature, but to government as a whole. How can democratic government be made to work better, think longer term, get less bogged down, do its job? If you would like to get that episode, all you have to do is subscribe to PPF Plus. You know how. Go to our website, ppfideas.com, or click on the link in the show description. That episode, all of our previous bonus episodes, all of our future bonus episodes will be yours, along with ad-free listening. Next time in our regular slot, we are going to be picking up on an idea that Hannah White mentioned at the end of the conversation that you've just heard. The idea of citizens' assemblies. I'm going to be talking to Claudia Schwalitz of Democracy Next about how citizens' assemblies work and the ways in which they could make democracy work much better. Do join us for all that. This has been Past, Present, Future.